Good day everyone, my name is Shunna Villarico from English 2B, and for today's lesson, we will be narrowing our focus to the characteristics of African literature. So without further ado, let's begin. At the end of this video, you are expected to define, analyze, and characterize African literature. But before we begin, let us first define what is literature. Literature is a faithful reproduction of man's manifold experiences, blended into a harmonious expression. It deals with ideas, thoughts, and emotions of man. Basically, it is about the field of expression. The subject or theme is about humanity or what we experience as humans. Let us now proceed to the African literature. Africa is a continent, and there are 54 nations which make up Africa. Each of these have their own identity, culture, tradition, tribes, and history. It preserves rich culture and tradition of the African nation. African literature is defined as literary works created by authors living in countries on the African continent, mainly lying in south of the Sahara. In African literature, the traditions of numerous African people and the interwoven historical development of the cultural traditions of Europe, Asia, India, and America are intertwined. African literature consists of body of work in different languages and various genres, ranging from oral literature or literature written in colonial languages, just like in French, Portuguese, and English. It is also written in predominant African languages, which is Amharic, Zulu, Xhosa, and Swahili. Before we discuss and enumerate the characteristics of African literature, do you have any idea what literature means to Africans? For Africans, literature is an art. It is full of beauty, unfold mysteries, and it improves the relation between communities. We are now going to proceed to the characteristics of African literature. The first one, we have the broad scope of production. This literature has been composed in English for Western and African audiences. It is also composed of African languages and African readers. African literature can be complicated. There are some experts who believe that African literature should only be composed in African language. However, others believe that African literature can be written in any languages as long as the author is from Africa. The next one is that it comes from all thoughts of Africa. Themes and contextual cues derive from the situations and poor environment of it. Slave narratives. African literature is written by fugitive slaves about their lives in South and often after escaping to freedom. Next one, we have the protests against colonization. African writers aimed at revealing the social evils of colonial rule and to encourage a sense of African. West African authors used their writings to speak out against enslavement and for racial equality. They argued against colonial stereotypes of Africans as primitive, savage, and lacking distinctive cultural and political systems of their own. Call for independence. Independence campaigns were led by nationalist leaders with charismatic personalities and great intellectual ability. In touch with international Pan-Africanists, they were able to frame ideas of equality and nationalism. African pride, creating African identities that promote the idea of a cultural movement of African literary renaissance. Next one is the hope of the future. It focuses on the literature of hope and despair over the betrayal of the goals of liberation struggles in Africa. Dissent. Writers express a different opinion through writing poems, stories, and etc., in which characters have profound messages to political issues. In a continent as ethnically and culturally diverse as Africa, it comes as no surprise that the literature has emerged it to be equally diverse and multifaceted, dealing with a range of social and cultural issues from women's rights to feminism to post-war and post-colonial identity. Contemporary African literature often documents how corrupt modern African governments perpetuate the suffering of African people. It is built upon the history of slavery, oppression, violation, and humiliation. Basically, it is written out of the disgustful life of Africans. Next one is that African literature has its several forms of expression, which is the oral tradition, written tradition, post-colonial African literature, pre-colonial literature, and colonial African literature. In oral tradition, sharing advice, histories, stories through talking and presenting simply means literature delivered by word of mouth. Research result shows that Africans rarely use paper for literature. They usually use oral techniques in telling stories, which is called the orature. The reason why they mainly focus on orature is that because they expect their audience to participate and respond. Next one is the written tradition. Writers express themselves in books, newspapers, literary pieces, and etc. through writing and encoding. Pre-colonial African literature means that literary works done before the coming of the white men to the African continent. Colonial African literature is written during the colonial period or that speaks about the colonial period in Africa. And the last one, we have the post-colonial African literature. It refers to writing produced after the political independence of various African states which were formerly subject to European colonial rule. And the last one, we have the expansion to another genre. It can be in hymns, romance, epic, poetry, fictional narrative, diaries and journals, philosophy, biography, and autobiography. For the self-assessment, you will be going to choose the letter of the correct answer. What is mostly interwoven in African literature? Letter A, culture and traditions. Letter B, food and cuisine. Letter C, arts and dances. Or letter D, technology. Great, you get the correct answer. Culture and tradition is mostly interwoven in African literature. As what I said a while ago, it deals with a range of social and cultural issues, from women's rights and feminism to post-war and post-colonial identity. African literature is built upon the history of slavery, oppression, violation, and humiliation. Basically, it is written out of this disgustful life of the Africans. I just wanted to leave this line from Off Water in the Spirit by Malidoma Party's song. As long as we are not ourselves, we will try to be what other people are. We should always remember that you could never be someone, but you could be yourself. I hope you learned a thing or two from this topic, and thank you for listening.